Fromsoft DLCs are where they deliver us the best content these games have to offer, perfecting the design elements of the base game, and as a result bringing with them the best bosses in the Souls series. Today I'll be ranking every boss across the series' DLCs, from the unfortunate fumbles to the generational bangers. I won't be including Shadow of the Erdtree's minor bosses, since it would make the video an hour long, but if you want my thoughts on those, feel free to check out my Elden Ring minor boss ranking. A reminder that this is just my subjective opinion on this subjective medium, and it's no superior or lesser than anyone else's, so please just show respect for others in the comments below. At least their name is fitting. They really are an utter failure of a boss. They hit far harder than a gank boss ever should, have incredible range and too much health. Their movesets aren't terribly designed, unlike the bosses below them. It's just the way Fromsoft made the failures utilise their attack pools in conjunction with one another that makes them incredibly boring to fight. They do have a pretty great soundtrack though. Sometimes in these games, it's difficult to separate the boss from the runback. That's most certainly the case with Ludden's Zalem. The frigid outskirts is unrivaled in just how terrible an area it is, and it serves as the runback to this boss. The entire area. The bosses themselves are decent enough, but putting them together was such an awful design choice. It's blatantly clear that they were an afterthought, and their movesets were not designed to complement each other, being taken directly from Arva's boss fight. I hate this boss. I hate gank bosses where the enemies have no synergy. I hate big beast bosses. I hate reused assets that add nothing to the experience, and I hate that stupid vision clouding, reindeer stuffed abomination of an area that is the frigid outskirts. I dislike NPC fights enough as it is, but Emir really takes it to the next level. His own moveset is just awful, with homing projectiles that don't really pose any threat other than being a constant annoyance, and basically nothing to defend himself at close range. Add a bunch of mindlessly dumped finger creepers in the arena, and you have a recipe for a truly irredeemable boss fight. The Shadow Tree avatar at least has an interesting concept, but I just feel all of its moves are unenjoyable to engage with. If it was a fun boss, I'd love seeing it burst back from the dead, but all I could think was, oh, I have to fight him again. Boring. There was no need to have it rebirth twice. The third phase loses all of its intrigue. It just doesn't give me any of the elements of a boss fight I truly enjoy. This is probably the most forgettable boss in Dark Souls 3. It begins as an NPC style battle, with regular enemies thrown in to gank you. The second stage sees a giant wolf akin to Sif joining the fray, but its moveset is basic and unengaging to fight. Given just how unremarkable it is, the Gravetender and Great Wolf definitely deserve a spot in the bad tier. Dear God, I'm gonna get slaughtered for this pick. I wish I could enjoy Vale's fight, as everything surrounding it is incredible. It's an immense spectacle atop the awesome Jagged Peak, and Egon's dialogue surrounding this boss is just so epic. Vale himself is just held back by his terrible moveset. He suffers from the same issues I have with Placiduous Axe, in that most of his moveset is just AoE spamming. Vale does have a few more melee and projectile attacks thrown in, one of the standouts for me being his flight around the arena, shooting fireballs at the player and crashing back to the ground. That move is actually pretty cool, but most of his melee attacks I just find so unintuitive to dodge, given you have to be so close to the boss to damage him, which results in you not being able to clearly read all of his tells due to Vale's immense size. At least they did make it so the player does more damage to the head. That seems to always work for Fromsoft. This boss has so much potential, but comparing it to dragon fights which focus on a simple and pure mechanical challenge, rather than overwhelming the player with huge spectacle focused attacks, is not hugely fair to me, and this just isn't my style of fight. Meta as a boss absolutely fascinated me. I was never expecting to learn more lore about the fingers in the DLC, but it becomes one of the most interesting things to discover. Meta also has an incredible visual design, and the arena being submerged beneath the sea is just so cool. Unfortunately, that's where the positives end, as I feel the fight itself isn't particularly fun. Her attacks have some strange hitboxes, especially the finger slaps from her side. It's not one I hate, but the most important thing for me in a Souls boss is that I actually enjoy fighting them, which I simply don't get with Meta. I don't think I hate Gaius as much as most of the community, but he really isn't a particularly good boss. His moveset is filled with broken hitboxes and obnoxious attacks, which just feel unenjoyable to fight. His design is relatively forgettable by Elden Ring standards, and has nothing to leave an impact on the player other than the tainted memories of how awful his moveset is. I'm probably one of the few people in the Souls community who doesn't have this boss towards the bottom of my list. I still don't think it's great, but I do find it to be a pretty funny fight, and while not all that fun, it's at least more engaging than many of the fights below it, due to the element of strategy present in the fight. Most people will consider this a minor boss, but it can be required to reach Bale depending on your path to the Jagged Peak, and this was the path I took first. It's my video and I've chosen to include it. That said, it does fall short of most of the major bosses in Elden Ring. I don't love NPC fights generally, and while there are many that do a better job with this formula than Ancient Dragon Man, he tends to simply mash buttons and pray clips you with the edge of his sword. It's just nowhere near as engaging as a more deeply considered boss would be. Half-Light is a pretty boring NPC encounter. I think the boss itself has a decent enough moveset, but the additional enemies that spawn alongside it just make this fight feel like a chore. Further adding to the drawn-out dullness of the fight is a long speech by the Judicator at the start, which the first time round is cool, but then just becomes annoying. The online aspect of this fight taken from the old monk is a nice touch, though it still suffers from the same problem as that fight many years later. I know Jory is a particularly unpopular boss. I can understand that, but I don't think he's that awful. Don't get me wrong, he definitely deserves his placement in the bad tier, but there's some redeeming qualities here. Some. So let me defend my placement. Pretty much all his moves are really well designed, and feel great to interact with. I think most people have issues with the gank element of this fight, but I actually really like the enemies he chooses to summon. On their own they're great, and they actually do go well with Jory's own moveset. The problem arises when he decides to use his spiral pillar attack, which can put you into some very bad positions. At least it's not as bad here as it is on that stairway towards the end of Enira Limb. Jory doesn't do anything special, and what he does do isn't handled as well as it could have been, so I'm not a massive fan, but he's certainly not terrible.
Alana is one of the better multi-enemy bosses in Dark Souls 2. She herself has a moveset which is not overly oppressive, but still manages to feel a constant threat to the player. This fight is pretty fun, if somewhat easy, when the skeleton minions are summoned. Though if Velstadt spawns, it can become a bit too much to manage, since he's one of the game's hardest bosses as is. The Gatekeeper boss of the series' first DLC is often overshadowed by the rest of its bosses, and while I do think it's undeniably the worst, the Sanctuary Guardian still holds up as a pretty good boss by Dark Souls 1's primitive standards. It has a great design and an arena I really feel deserves more praise, paired with combat that is above average for a beast-like boss, making this boss well worthy of recognition that it rarely receives.
This boss has a cousin who we'll talk about in the minor boss ranking, who frankly left more of an impression on me than the Remembrance variant. But Dancing Lion is a good boss, primarily on the conceptual level. The switching between phases reminds me a lot of Soul of Cinder, who if you watch my Dark Souls 3 boss ranking you'll know I speak highly of, but also like Soul of Cinder. Some movesets are definitely more desirable than others. My main issue with the fight is just how janky it can end up being. The camera is notoriously awful, and he leaps around so much that it can be hard to get your bearings and react to what he's doing. I do like this fight, but I much prefer calculated dual style bosses, as opposed to encounters with erratic beasts. I've decided to rank Inner Genichiro significantly lower than his original variant, despite this boss being superior mechanically. The reason for this is that the main appeal of the original Genichiro fight was that it was a challenging wall in the game, which forces the player to understand the combat and provides them the tools they need to beat the game. By the time you get to fighting Inner Genichiro, you will likely have mastered Sekiro's mechanics, and this fight will offer very little challenge as a result, making it a far less memorable fight than the rest of Genichiro's incarnations.
Arthur is nothing hugely special. Her design is amazing, but her moveset is average and there's not a huge deal of spectacle or story surrounding the boss. I like Arthur a good deal, but don't feel like she deserves to be alongside the bosses I genuinely find to be examples of FromSoftware's high quality game design. She's just enjoyable, not a fight that blows me away by any means, but I will note that I have a negative predisposition to beast-style bosses, which is definitely a factor in this placement. Sin is one of the most unique dragon bosses in the series. He's perhaps the only FromSoft boss to utilise the toxic status effect in a way that doesn't feel unfair and unbalanced, and the weapon durability reduction is a really cool touch, if a little annoying at times. His design is amazing and the arena is pretty good, and his attacks for the most part are well designed. The main issue with this fight stems from his movement, which can see the player having to run around and chase him, similar to the Elden Beast or Maris, an aspect of the fight which isn't particularly fun. Before fighting this boss, I'd heard plenty of praise for the Ivory King, some calling it the best in Dark Souls 2. Upon fighting him, I understood that notion, though can't even remotely agree. The second phase is great. It has a diverse moveset with moves that all feel great to dodge. Alone, it would absolutely be one of the best bosses in this game. However, the first phase is significantly less enjoyable to me. While the concept is great, the Loist Knights are honestly pretty useless. Rather than having one Loist Knight for each Shard Knight, it ends up being 4 Loist Knights all attacking one enemy, leaving the player to deal with the rest alone. Seriously, I can see the bones of Gladius's second phase in this poorly managed gang. While I do certainly enjoy this fight when it gets to the second phase, and the presentation is phenomenal, it's held back by its flawed and tedious opening stages.
The Putrescent Knight used to be one of my least favourite bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree, but on my most recent playthrough it really grew on me. Perhaps guard countering it is just more fun than dodging it. There were certainly a few moves where I could vividly see this was the case. While the presentation is fairly weak, especially when it's the boss tied to the incredibly significant character of Saint Trina, the visual identity is distinct and most of its moveset is fun. I don't love every move, and I'm never completely gripped in the engagement. I wouldn't love fighting the knight for hours on end like I would Ishin or Rolana, but I'm pleased to say I have come around to this boss.
I think Romina is massively underrated by the community. As you can see by her placement here, I don't think she's a masterclass of boss design by any means, but she's better than many give her credit for. I think this largely comes down to her being pretty easy, especially when compared with the brutal challenge most of Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses provide. But her moveset is fun to engage with, and many of her moves feel great to dodge. All her tells are fair and give you plenty of time to reasonably react to, and she even has a great AoE, a rarity in FromSoft's bosses, and bosses in general, not to mention having one of the most standout visual identities in the series, striking saturated pink starkly contrasted to the typical dark tones of the Souls genre. I really like Romina and feel her spot towards the upper end of the decent tier is definitely deserved. Oh dear, we've reached Elden Ring's most divisive boss. I was not pleased when I first saw the leaks that Radahn would be the DLC's final boss, and still wish we could have gotten something more original. I love Radahn as much as anybody, but this version falls so far short of the Star Scourge. His moveset is serviceable, and there is actually some great moves in here, but let's address the elephant in the room. The hate for Shadow of the Erdtree was not remotely justified. It got review bombed to hell simply because it was so vastly more difficult than Elden Ring's base game, which reached a wider, less gritty audience than the rest of the series had. But it still gave you plenty of options to lessen that struggle by exploring the world, and the bosses, while hard, are for the most part entirely fair. I had no issues with Mesmer or Rolana, who took me 30 and 40 attempts respectively. I've no hit in Ishin and have never once found myself getting frustrated at Melania, but Consort Radahn just takes the mick a little bit. He's not so difficult he's fun, he's so difficult he feels unfair. And much of his moveset genuinely is. We all remember the triple sword slash that was unavoidable unless you light rolled. We all remember the excessive visuals that obscured his moveset and made the boss a complete cluster, made the game lag on PC really badly. You get the point. The player couldn't reasonably be expected to respond to everything he did. I've seen people defend him, saying, just use a shield, just use perfume bottles. Strategies like that are not a valid defense for a boss. In these games, players should be able to beat the boss with the build they've established across their playthrough, not be forced to undo it entirely. Radahn is a fight with plenty of positives, but it's dragged down so drastically by all the elements of the fight which just feel like FromSoft is desperately trying to one-up Melania. I knew they were going to give it a shot, and expected the result to be a poor boss, but it's so disappointing to see my fears realised. Obviously I still like Radahn a reasonable degree, evidenced by his placement above so many other bosses, but he's just not a great fight. Maybe he was completely fixed by the nerfs, maybe they made him fair and he's a great boss now. I wouldn't know, I haven't fought him since the DLC released. I don't want to go into too much detail here, since the normal version of Ishin will be much higher on this list, but Inner Ishin is lower due to the same reasons as Inner Genichiro, being much less of a threat after you've struggled through the immense challenge of normal Ishin. He's higher than Genichiro's Inner variant, since Ishin is a fight which I enjoy significantly more, so naturally do really enjoy this form too, but I would much rather just fight the standard Ishin. I did no-hit this boss though, that was pretty fun. Mid-era is certainly growing on me. The first time I fought him, I didn't love his moveset and found him to be a relatively detached battle. His presentation is phenomenal, and it's a fight on a scale rarely seen in Souls, not to mention having one of the best OSTs in the series. While I am definitely a fan of this fight now, I distinctly prefer duel-style fights over big beast fights like Nadir. It's a personal preference that definitely applies here, so while I do enjoy fighting this epic dragon, he isn't as fun to me as bosses higher on this list.
I'll say off the bat that Manus does not deserve all the reverence he gets as the hardest boss in Dark Souls. He's up there, but in comparison to so many other bosses in the series, he's not all that tough. That being said, he's one of the most mechanically varied fights in DS1, and his extreme degree of speed really shakes up the gameplay to make it far more enjoyable. On top of that is his incredible lore and connection to Artorias, as well as likely being the furtive pygmy. Everything about Manus is solid, though his moveset doesn't quite have the polish demanded to reach the high standards of bosses higher on this list.
I always see so much praise for Midra. He's often discussed as one of Elden Ring's best bosses. People seem to absolutely love him. And I can kinda see why, to an extent, but I can't bring myself to believe that his gameplay holds up against the likes of Malekith and Messmer. There's just no comparison. His presentation is undoubtedly phenomenal, and it's an awesome fight, but for me, combat will always be the most important element of a boss, and Midra's is merely solid. His attacks do feel good to engage with and satisfying to dodge, with the frenzy status not becoming an annoyance like elements tend to in these games, but he doesn't bring anything to the table that other bosses in this tier do. His moveset hardly feels more complex than the Penetrator. More refined, definitely, but more advanced? Not massively. I guess I was just disappointed that such a cool boss didn't do more to impress me with his mechanics. All that said, I still think he's definitely deserving of this spot, and just barely misses out on the top 10 in Elden Ring.
This will definitely be a controversial placement, but I much prefer the reskin Smelter Demon to the original. I prefer the oddly telegraphed moves with lengthy delays that make the fight significantly more fun for me. I also prefer the design of the boss, likely because I just think Blue Fire is really damn cool. Overall, I just think this shiny Pokemon is a much more dynamic, challenging, and engaging fight than its standard counterpart. It was cool to see them mixed into one to return in Night Rain, though this boss doesn't translate hugely well to Night Rain's free-player oriented combat. There's one major feature that stands out about Soulsborne. Is it the enthrallingly designed arena, the usage of Dark Souls 2's questionable combat to create a great moveset, or even the score that stands out in a game full of forgettable tracks? No, it's the run back. That goddamn run back. I genuinely think if there were Stakes of Marika in Dark Souls 2, this boss could be a tier higher on the list. But when I'm honestly deterred from fighting a boss just because of the run back, I have to acknowledge it. Soulsborne is an amazing fight by Dark Souls 2 standards, though those standards are not very high, and the awkward combat and dodgy hitboxes definitely hold it back. Nevertheless, Soulsborne deserves praise for putting that clunky Dark Souls 2 combat to good use and creating an enjoyable fight out of it. And let's not pretend as if Dark Souls 1's combat was without flaw either, but I'll be damned if fighting this boss is worth going through that abysmal run back.
As far as I've seen, Lawrence is one of the most polarizing bosses in the series. I'm on the side of the people who really enjoy him. His moveset is pretty great, he has an excellent soundtrack, and call me Dazza because I'm a sucker for whacking flames on things to make them cooler. I don't find him nearly as difficult as people claim him to be, though he still poses a noteworthy challenge. Despite how good I consider this fight to be, he's still ranked as the 4th best of the 5 Old Hunters bosses, which should really demonstrate the immense quality of Fromsoft's DLC bosses. By many considered to be the hardest boss in the series, even to this day, Orphan of Kos is definitely a fight that lives up to the high standards set by the Old Hunters DLC. The breathtaking visuals are set as soon as you enter the fight, with the haunting face of the Astral Clock Tower looming over the gorgeous coastal arena as you take on one of Bloodborne's classic eldritch monstrosities. This is paired with the disturbing sound design, as the Orphan swings his dead mother's placenta at you, screeching and roaring in a manner that can make any Souls veteran quake in their boots. The immense difficulty and excellent combat mechanics of this encounter highlight the true horror of fighting this great one, and it's a daunting challenge that cements itself as one of From Software's most memorable experiences to this day.
Calamite is my personal favourite dragon boss in Souls, which is definitely a controversial opinion, given the popularity of fights such as Midir and Bale. What sets Calamite apart for me is his great mechanics. While some of his hitboxes can be janky due to Dark Souls' age, it's mostly an issue I feel is overshadowed by the brilliant design of the fight. His flame attacks are great, his melee swipes give the fight another level of challenge, and the Calamity Vision is one of the coolest attacks in Dark Souls 1. Not to mention his design is incredible, a dragon with black scales not dissimilar to that of Lich Dragon Fortis Axe. Calamite is one of the hardest bosses in all of Souls for me, and I find that challenge incredibly engaging. Unfortunately for Calamite, the bosses higher on this list do everything he does, but better.
This is universally renowned as the best variant of Owl. It takes all the incredible aspects of the Owl Father and improves on them in every way. It really is as simple as just being a much better version of the prior fight at Harato Estate, which is why the Inner Father is much higher on the list.
Taking the crown as the best boss in Dark Souls 2, Fume Knight is pretty unanimously agreed upon as its best encounter. He feels so much more refined than most of the game, really showing that Dark Souls 2 found its footing with its DLCs. I honestly think if Fume Knight didn't have to deal with the awful combat of DS2 and was part of Dark Souls 3 instead, he could be one of FromSoft's best bosses. All of the ideas behind this fight are very well considered, but my enjoyment of the boss is lessened by some incredibly questionable hitboxes, especially in his second phase. I don't know what could be improved about the Fume Knight on a conceptual level. Unfortunately, the lackluster gameplay of Dark Souls 2 is enough to hold him back from a higher honour as one of Soulsborne's greatest boss fights.
Ludwig is one of two bosses I consider the perfect embodiment of Fromsoft boss design, with the other being my favourite in the series, who we'll explore in a later video. He has a design that tells his story perfectly, and the arena accentuates this so well. He has one of the best phase transition cutscenes in all of Souls, and the flow of the fight blends perfectly with the incredible soundtrack that showcases the lore and qualities of the boss through audio, a trademark of Fromsoft's highest quality bosses. The Moonlight Greatsword is such a nice addition to his design, the teal glow distinguishing the fight from many of the dark bosses of Bloodborne. I personally prefer the second phase of the fight, being more in line with the honourable jewels I'm so fond of. Ludwig is seen by so many Soulsborne fans as the peak of their boss design, and while I don't find his moveset as fun to engage with as the few bosses I have higher, he still takes a decisive position among my favourite video game bosses of all time. R'Larna had the potential to be higher on this list, if only she'd had a cutscene to make me care more. That's not to say I don't like her lore, I think it's pretty great, but if you don't discover it before the fight, the encounter loses a lot of weight because of it. Thankfully, R'Larna is both mechanically and visually incredible. Her fight feels like a blend of Pontiff Sullivan and Lady Maria, with the fast pace and combo variety of Melania. She's one of the most challenging encounters in the series, and I absolutely love it. Her design is incredible. The flaming sword aesthetic may have been done to death by now, but there's no denying that when you see it, you're in for an awesome fight. R'Larna really is one of the most mechanically enticing bosses Fromsoft have made, and I really feel she got the short end of the stick thanks to the discourse surrounding Shadow of the Erdtree's difficulty. While I feel those criticisms are completely justified for Consort Radahn, who even in spite of my level 1 dagger only no summon run on Elden Ring, took me around 150 attempts to defeat, R'Larna's difficulty feels entirely earned, balanced and fair, and I think she's as close to perfect as any other boss, just not quite as much as the fight that surpasses her. Messmer is the poster child for the best DLC in Souls, and Fromsoft definitely chose the best boss to represent it. Messmer excels in all areas. Fantastic gameplay, compelling lore, gripping visual design. It all comes together to create Elden Ring's best boss fight. His opening cutscene is chilling and enthralling, as is the fight itself, with blinding speed that requires incredibly swift reactions and precise movements. Basically every move has flame after effects to punish sloppy dodging and keep the player on their toes for the entire encounter. His second phase is just as strong, the snakes having frenzied hitboxes, but none of the jank of the snakes from Bloodborne's Shadows of Yharnam. He's one of the hardest bosses in Souls, and it all feels incredibly fair and earned. Messmer is the high point of Shadow of the Erdtree, and definitely deserves to be among the best of the best in Fromsoft boss roster.
Artorias has some of my favourite lore and build-up of any Souls boss. It's unsurprising given he had entire DLC centred around him, but Artorias really does take it to another level. His design is so cool, the broken arm being a mark of From's environmental storytelling. While Dark Souls 1 is incredibly clunky and not nearly as refined as newer Souls games, it's really hard to see that in this boss. Artorias has combat that feels more akin to that of Dark Souls 3 than his own game, and it's just as highly perfected as the bosses from the third game in the trilogy. I consider every move he possesses to be extremely well balanced, challenging and fair. A balance the first Dark Souls sometimes struggles to meet. The only thing holding Artorias back from the highest tier, that being the phenomenal tier, is his dated design, with some hitboxes, movesets and interactions showing the age of Dark Souls 1. For the time he was made, Artorias was an absolutely monumental achievement in boss design, likely my favourite released in any game at that point.
In my opinion, Lady Maria is the height of Bloodborne. She truly perfected the fast-paced and aggressive combat of the game, with her nimble moveset. I do wish she had more posture in the first phase, so you couldn't stunlock her quite so easily, but it isn't a detriment to my enjoyment of the fight. Maria's attacks are all nearly perfectly designed, and I'm a sucker for cool bosses with dual swords. Her usage of Bloodflame is one of the coolest aesthetics in Bloodborne, and on top of that, all her moves are mechanically engaging, and create an incredible flow to her fight. As with all the bosses at the top of the list, her visual and environmental storytelling is unparalleled by anyone besides Fromsoft, with her sins being hinted at throughout the preceding level and her desperation to hide them from you as she descends into the use of blood arts, highlighting a tragic yet haunting lore. This sank it in the soundtrack, which is one of my favourites in the game with one of my favourite OSTs of all time. Lady Maria is an unbelievable step up from most of Bloodborne's bosses, and is completely deserving of her spot at the top of the list. In my eyes, Gale is the pinnacle of the Souls series, and I know I'm not alone. There are so many other videos ranking the best bosses in Souls, and the vast majority have Gale in the top 10, most with him occupying the top spot. It's easy to see why. He has all the elements of an incredible boss. His combat takes advantage of all the strengths of DS3, and evolves as the fight goes on, telling his story in his movements. His score has grown to be one of my favourites in the series over the years, and the visual design is impeccable. Phase 3 is definitely my favourite, his flaming red cloak contrasting with the furious blue lightning frightening as you duel at the end of time after all else has fallen to rot. He has possibly my favourite cutscene in any of these games, and one of the best quotes in "Is this the blood of the dark soul?" Gale doesn't fall short in a single area. He's perfect in every aspect, and I take no shame in echoing the sentiment everyone else has shared, that Slave Knight Gale is FromSoft's magnum opus. There's my thoughts on every major boss in FromSoft's numerous DLCs, and I think it's safe to say that for the most part they vastly outshine the rosters of the base game. Of course, as always, I welcome respectful discussion in the comments below. Just remember that this is an inherently subjective topic. I hope you've enjoyed this video and might stick around for my future videos.